The day George Strait was surprised. From idol to emotional fan in a matter of minutes, the morning sun painted the Texas sky in shades of amber and gold, casting long shadows across the sprawling ranch where George Strait had called home for decades. At 72 years old, the king of country music stood on his porch sipping coffee from a chipped mug that had seen countless dawns just like this one. His weathered hands, which had strummed guitars and signed autographs for millions of fans, now trembled slightly as he watched his 10-year-old granddaughter Emma chase butterflies in the meadow beyond the fence. Emma's laughter echoed across the property, a sound more precious to George than any standing ovation he had ever received. Her blonde hair caught the sunlight as she spun in circles, arms outstretched, completely unaware that her grandfather was one of the most celebrated musicians in American history. To her, he was simply Grandpa George, the man who taught her to ride horses, told her bedtime stories about brave cowboys, and made the best pancakes in all of Texas. George had built his entire career on authenticity, on singing about real life, real love, and real heartbreak. But nothing had prepared him for the authentic love he felt, watching this little girl discover the world around her. After losing his daughter Jennifer in that devastating car accident so many years ago, George had wondered if his heart would ever feel complete again. Emma had filled spaces he didn't even know were empty. The screen door creaked open behind him, and his wife Norma appeared, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. After 47 years of marriage, she could read his thoughts like sheet music. "You're thinking about taking her somewhere special today, aren't you?" she asked, settling beside him on the porch swing they had shared through decades of joy and sorrow. George nodded, his eyes never leaving Emma as she bent down to examine a wildflower. That new theme park opened up in San Antonio, Lone Star Adventureland. She's been talking about it for weeks, showing me pictures from their commercials. He paused, running his fingers along the rim of his coffee mug. "I just want to give her a normal day, Norma. No cameras, no autograph seekers, no reporters asking about my next album. Just a grandpa and his granddaughter eating cotton candy and riding roller coasters. If you're enjoying this story about the legendary George Strait, discovering something beautiful about his own legacy, we'd love to hear from you. Please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what your favorite George Strait song means to you. Your stories inspire us to keep sharing these touching moments that remind us music truly connects all of our hearts." Norma squeezed his hand gently. She understood the weight that fame had placed on their family over the years, the constant touring, the pressure to maintain his image, the way simple family moments became complicated when fans recognized him. "You know people are going to notice you," she said softly. "That voice of yours is unmistakable, and you've got that walk that gives you away every time." George chuckled, a low rumble that had charmed audiences for decades. "I've got a plan for that. Baseball cap, sunglasses, maybe one of those ridiculous Hawaiian shirts you bought me for Christmas. I'll look like any other tourist grandfather trying to keep up with his granddaughter." Emma came bounding up the porch steps, her cheeks flushed with excitement and her small hands cupping something carefully. "Grandpa George, look what I found." She opened her palms to reveal a tiny purple flower, slightly crushed, but still beautiful. "It's for you because purple is your favorite color, right?" George's throat tightened with emotion. Purple wasn't his favorite color, but he would never correct her. In that moment, watching her face beam with the joy of giving, he realized that this was what life was really about. Not the gold records on his wall or the awards gathering dust on his shelves, but these small, perfect moments with the people who loved him simply for who he was, beneath all the fame. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," he said, accepting the flower with the same reverence he might show a Grammy award. "How would you like to go on an adventure today? Just you and me?" Emma's eyes grew wide with anticipation, like a real adventure, with roller coasters and games and maybe those giant turkey legs I saw on TV. "The biggest adventure," George promised, already mentally preparing for what would surely be a challenging day of trying to remain anonymous while his granddaughter experienced the magic of childhood wonder. An hour later, George stood in front of his bedroom mirror, barely recognizing himself. The baseball cap sat awkwardly on his head, and the bright orange Hawaiian shirt with dancing flamingos made him look like a tourist who had gotten lost on his way to Florida. Norma had insisted on the disguise, adding sunglasses so dark he could barely see through them. "You look ridiculous," she said with a laugh, straightening his collar. "But that's probably the point. No one will expect George Strait to be caught dead in that shirt. Emma appeared in the doorway, dressed in her favorite pink sundress and carrying a small backpack covered with unicorns. "Grandpa, you look funny. Are we going to a costume party?" George knelt down to her level, his knees creaking slightly with age. "Something like that, sweetheart. Today I'm not George Strait the singer. I'm just George, your grandfather, who wants to ride the Ferris wheel with you." The drive to San Antonio took 2 hours, with Emma chattering excitedly about everything she wanted to do at the park. George listened to her animated descriptions of roller coasters and carnival games, marveling at her ability to find wonder in the simplest things. When had he lost that sense of wonder? When had performing music become more about business than about the pure joy of creating something beautiful? As they pulled into the massive parking lot of Lone Star Adventureland, George felt his stomach tighten with nervous energy. The park sprawled before them like a small city, with towering roller coasters reaching toward the sky and the sound of laughter and music drifting on the warm Texas breeze. Families streamed through the entrance gates, children pulling their parents toward various attractions, everyone eager to begin their day of fun. "This is it, Emma," George said, taking her hand as they walked toward the entrance. "Our big adventure." The young man working the ticket booth couldn't have been more than 20 years old, with shaggy brown hair and a name tag that read Tyler. As George approached, fishing for his wallet while trying to keep his head down, he noticed Tyler's eyes narrow slightly, studying his face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. George's heart began to race. This was exactly what he had hoped to avoid. He could almost see the wheels turning in Tyler's mind, recognition dawning slowly but surely. The disguise that had seemed foolproof in his bedroom mirror now felt as transparent as glass. "2 adult admission tickets, please," George said, trying to disguise his distinctive voice by speaking in a higher pitch than usual. The result sounded more like someone doing a bad impression of Mickey Mouse than a grandfather trying to remain anonymous. Tyler's eyebrows shot up, and for a moment, George was certain his cover was blown. But instead of calling out his name or asking for an autograph, the young man simply smiled and processed their tickets with professional efficiency. "You all have a wonderful day at the park," Tyler said, handing over their admission bands. "And sir?" He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice so that only George could hear. "Your secret's safe with me. Hope you and your granddaughter make some beautiful memories today." George felt a surge of gratitude toward this young man who could have easily created a scene, but chose instead to protect their privacy. "Thank you," he said quietly, his natural voice slipping through for just a moment. As they walked through the entrance gates, Emma tugging on his hand and pointing excitedly at a spinning teacup ride in the distance, George realized that this day was already different from what he had expected. The first surprise had been Tyler's respectful recognition and discretion. What other surprises might this day hold? The park was more magnificent than he had imagined, with themed areas representing different periods of Texas history. They passed through sections dedicated to the Wild West, complete with saloon-style buildings and staff dressed as cowboys and saloon girls. Another area celebrated the state's oil boom heritage, with rides designed to look like giant oil derricks. Emma was mesmerized by everything, her head swiveling in all directions as she tried to take in every sight, sound, and smell. "Grandpa George, can we get cotton candy? And can we ride that big roller coaster? And can we play the ring toss game? And can we—" "Slow down there, partner," George said with a chuckle, falling easily into the cowboy persona that had always felt natural to him. "We've got all day to do everything you want. Let's start with that cotton candy you mentioned." They made their way to a vendor stand, painted to look like an old-fashioned general store. The woman working behind the counter was perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and laugh lines that spoke of years of bringing joy to children and families. "What can I get for you folks?" she asked cheerfully, already reaching for a paper cone to begin spinning the sugar confection. "Pink cotton candy, please," Emma said, practically bouncing with excitement. As the vendor began creating the fluffy pink cloud of spun sugar, George found himself studying the families around them. Parents pushing strollers, teenagers trying to look too cool while secretly enjoying themselves, elderly couples holding hands as they watched their grandchildren experience the wonder of childhood. This was America, he realized. This was the heart of the country that had embraced his music for so many years. The vendor handed Emma her cotton candy, which was nearly as large as her head, and George couldn't help but smile at the look of pure delight on her face. She immediately tore off a piece and offered it to him, insisting that he try it. "It tastes like happiness," she declared seriously, as if this was an official diagnosis. George laughed, a genuine sound that drew a few curious glances from nearby families. For a moment, he worried that his distinctive laugh might give him away, but everyone seemed too absorbed in their own fun to pay him much attention. They spent the next hour moving from attraction to attraction, with Emma leading the way and George following happily behind. They rode the carousel twice, with Emma insisting on the horse painted like a Texas palomino. They played carnival games, with George winning her a stuffed armadillo that she immediately named Austin after her favorite city. As they walked toward the roller coaster section of the park, George noticed something that made his steps slow. In the distance, he could see a large amphitheater with a sign advertising "Live Entertainment, Tribute to American Legends, Shows Every Hour." His stomach clenched with a mixture of anxiety and curiosity. Would his music be featured in such a show? The thought both thrilled and terrified him. On one hand, it would be fascinating to see how others interpreted his work. On the other hand, the risk of being recognized would increase dramatically if his songs were being performed just a few hundred yards away from where he stood. Emma noticed his hesitation and followed his gaze to the amphitheater. "Ooh, Grandpa, can we watch the show? I love music." George's mind raced. Every instinct told him to steer clear of the performance venue, to keep their day focused on rides and games, where he could remain safely anonymous. But looking down at Emma's eager face, he found it impossible to disappoint her. "Let's see what time the next show starts," he said, already knowing that he was walking into potentially dangerous territory. As they approached the amphitheater, George could hear the sound of a country song drifting from the speakers, though he couldn't quite make out which one. His heart began to beat faster, and he found himself gripping Emma's hand a little tighter. Whatever happened next, George realized, this day was far from the simple, quiet outing he had planned. Something told him that the biggest surprises were yet to come. The amphitheater was larger than George had initially realized, with curved rows of benches that could easily seat 300 people. Even from the entrance, he could see that it was nearly full, families settling in with snacks and drinks while children fidgeted excitedly in their seats. The stage was professionally designed, complete with state-of-the-art sound equipment and lighting that would rival many concert venues where George himself had performed. Emma tugged on his sleeve, pointing to a schedule board near the entrance. "Look, Grandpa, the next show starts in 15 minutes. It says, 'Tribute to American Legends.' That sounds so cool." George studied the board more carefully, his heart sinking as he read the fine print. Featuring the music of Johnny Cash, Dolly Parton, Willie Nelson, and George Strait, his name was right there, printed in bold letters for everyone to see. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was trying to remain anonymous while attending a show that would literally be celebrating his own work. "I don't know, sweetheart," George said carefully, trying to think of a way to redirect their attention elsewhere. "That roller coaster over there looks pretty exciting. Maybe we should—" "Please, Grandpa George." Emma's eyes were wide with pleading, and she clasped her hands together in a gesture that reminded him so strongly of Jennifer at that age that his breath caught in his throat. "I promise I'll ride any scary roller coaster you want after the show, please." Looking into those innocent blue eyes, George knew he was defeated. He had never been able to say no to Jennifer, and he certainly couldn't say no to Emma. "It's all right," he said with a sigh that was equal parts resignation and affection. "But we sit in the back, and if you get bored, we can leave early." They found seats in the last row, tucked into a corner where George hoped the shadows would provide additional cover. He pulled his baseball cap down lower and adjusted his sunglasses, feeling increasingly ridiculous but desperate to maintain his anonymity. Emma bounced excitedly beside him, sharing her cotton candy and commenting on everything she saw. "That lady has the prettiest dress," she whispered, pointing to a woman in the third row wearing a flowing blue sundress. "And that little boy has the same backpack as my friend Sarah. Oh, and Grandpa, look at all those people wearing cowboy hats. They look just like you do at home." George smiled despite his nervousness. Emma's observations reminded him of why he had fallen in love with country music in the first place. It was music for real people, for families like these who worked hard all week and came to places like this on weekends to make memories with their children and grandchildren. The lights dimmed, and a man in his 40s wearing a sequined western shirt stepped onto the stage. His voice boomed through the sound system with the practiced enthusiasm of someone who had been performing for crowds his entire career. "Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, Welcome to our tribute to American legends." The crowd erupted in applause, and Emma clapped so enthusiastically that George worried she might fall off the bench. "Today we're going to celebrate the music that has defined American culture for generations. We're going to honor the artists who've given us soundtracks to our lives, our loves, and our losses." The first performer took the stage, a young woman with dark hair who bore a striking resemblance to a young Dolly Parton. She launched into 9 to 5 with impressive vocal range and energy that had the entire audience clapping along. George found himself genuinely enjoying the performance, momentarily forgetting his anxiety about being recognized. Emma was mesmerized, leaning forward in her seat and absorbing every note. "She's really good, isn't she, Grandpa?" she whispered during the applause between songs. "She certainly is," George agreed, and he meant it. The young woman had genuine talent, and her obvious love for the music she was performing shone through in every gesture and vocal inflection. The Dolly Parton tribute concluded with "I Will Always Love You," and George felt his throat tighten with emotion. He had known Dolly personally for decades, had shared stages with her, and had always admired not just her musical talent but her genuine kindness and philanthropy. Hearing her songs performed with such respect and skill reminded him of why he had gotten into music in the first place, to touch people's hearts and make them feel understood. Next came a Johnny Cash tribute, performed by a tall, dark-haired man whose deep voice and somber stage presence captured the essence of the man in black perfectly. He performed Ring of Fire and Walk the Line with the gravity and intensity that those songs deserved, and George noticed several veterans in the audience standing and saluting during Ragged Old Flag. The Willie Nelson segment followed, with a performer who had clearly studied every nuance of Willie's distinctive guitar playing and vocal phrasing. The audience swayed along to On the Road Again and sang every word of Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain. George watched an elderly couple in the front row holding hands and mouthing the words to each other, and he realized that these songs weren't just entertainment, they were the soundtrack to real people's real lives. And then the announcer's voice cut through his thoughts like a lightning bolt. "And now, ladies and gentlemen, we come to our final tribute of the afternoon. We're going to honor a man who has been called the King of Country Music, a Texas legend who has given us more #1 hits than any other country artist in history. Please welcome our tribute to George Strait." The audience erupted in applause, and George felt his entire body go rigid. Emma looked up at him with confusion, not understanding why her grandfather had suddenly become as still as a statue. The first notes of Amarillo by Morning began to play, and George's heart started pounding so hard he was certain Emma could hear it. The performer, a middle-aged man with a voice remarkably similar to George's own, stepped forward and began to sing one of George's most beloved songs. But instead of simply performing the song, he stopped after the first verse and addressed the audience directly. "You know, folks, before I continue with this beautiful song, I want to tell you a story about what George Strait's music means to people. This isn't just entertainment. This is music that saves lives." George's hands began to tremble, and he gripped the edge of the bench so tightly that his knuckles turned white. This wasn't what he had expected. This wasn't just a musical tribute. It was something much more personal and powerful. The performer continued, his voice carrying clearly through the amphitheater's excellent sound system. "A few months ago, I received a letter from a young woman named Sarah Martinez. Sarah, if you're out there listening, this is for you." A spotlight suddenly illuminated a section near the front of the amphitheater, and George could see a young woman in her 20s standing up, tears already streaming down her face. The performer gestured for her to come forward, and with obvious emotional difficulty, she made her way to the stage. "Sarah, would you like to tell everyone about your letter?" the performer asked gently, offering her the microphone. Sarah's voice was shaky but clear as she spoke. 2 years ago, I lost my father in a car accident on Highway 35. He was coming home from work, just like he had every day for 20 years, and a drunk driver ran a red light. Her voice broke, and she paused to collect herself. "I was angry at God, angry at the world, angry at everything. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't function." The amphitheater had become completely silent, except for Sarah's voice. Even Emma had stopped fidgeting and was listening with rapt attention, though George doubted she fully understood what she was hearing. "One night, I was driving around aimlessly, crying, and honestly thinking about ending it all," Sarah continued. I turned on the radio and I Cross My Heart was playing. My dad used to sing that song to my mum every anniversary. And suddenly, instead of hearing sadness, I heard my dad's voice telling me that love doesn't end when someone dies. That song reminded me that my father's love for me was still real, still alive in my heart. George felt tears stinging his eyes behind his dark sunglasses. He had written I Cross My Heart as a love song for the movie Pure Country, but he had never imagined it could carry someone through such devastating grief. Sarah took a deep breath and continued. That song led me to other George Strait songs, and each one seemed to speak directly to what I was going through. Give It Away taught me that holding on to anger was poisoning my own happiness. I Believe helped me understand that death isn't the end of love. George Strait's music literally saved my life. The applause that followed was unlike anything George had ever heard, not the wild cheering of a concert crowd, but the deep, respectful appreciation of people who understood that they had just witnessed something sacred. He watched Sarah wipe her eyes as she returned to her seat, and he realized that his own cheeks were wet with tears. But the performer wasn't finished. Sarah isn't the only person whose life has been touched by George Strait's music. Would you like to hear another story? An older man near the middle of the amphitheater stood up, his posture indicating military service even in civilian clothes. Without needing an invitation, he began to speak in a voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. Marine Sergeant Daniel Rodriguez retired, he announced. I served 3 tours in Afghanistan, and I can tell you that George Strait's music was our soundtrack in that desert. When we were scared, when we were homesick, when we weren't sure we were going to make it home, we played his songs and remembered what we were fighting for. He paused, and George could see the emotion playing across the veteran's weathered face. There was this one night we were pinned down for hours in a firefight. My radio operator had George Strait's greatest hits on his phone, and during a lull in the shooting, he started playing The Chair. 24 hardened Marines singing along to a country love song in the middle of a war zone. That song reminded us that somewhere back home, there were people waiting for us, loving us, believing in us. George's vision blurred completely now, and he felt Emma's small hand slip into his. She didn't say anything, but somehow she understood that her grandfather needed comfort, needed connection to something real and immediate. Sergeant Rodriguez continued, George Strait's music didn't just entertain us, it kept us human. It reminded us what we were fighting to protect. When I listen to Carrying Your Love With Me now, I don't just hear a pretty song. I hear the voices of my brothers who made it home, and I hear the voices of those who didn't. The amphitheater was absolutely silent now, everyone absorbed in the weight of what they were hearing. George realized that something extraordinary was happening here. This wasn't just a tribute show, it was a testimony to the power of music to heal, to inspire, to literally keep people alive. Emma squeezed his hand tighter and whispered, Grandpa, why are you crying? George looked down at his granddaughter, this beautiful child who represented hope and love, and all the reasons he had kept making music even during his darkest moments. How could he explain to her that he was crying because he was finally understanding the true impact of his life's work? How could he tell her that these stories were showing him that his music had been more than entertainment? It had been a lifeline, for people he had never met but somehow loved. Because sometimes, he whispered back, his voice barely audible, beautiful things make us cry happy tears. The performer on stage wasn't finished. We have one more story to share, and this one is very special because it involves someone who's here with us today. George's blood ran cold. Surely they weren't going to call him out specifically. Tyler had promised his secret was safe. But as the performer continued speaking, George realized the story was about someone else entirely. Mrs. Betty and Mr. Frank Williams have been married for 51 years, the performer announced, and an elderly couple near the front of the amphitheater stood up slowly, leaning on each other for support. They wrote to tell us that they danced to I Cross My Heart at their wedding in 1973, and they've danced to it every anniversary since. Mrs. Williams took the microphone with shaking hands. Last year, my Frank was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, she said, her voice quavering but determined. Most days now he doesn't remember my name, doesn't remember our children, doesn't remember the life we built together. George felt his heart breaking for this woman, for the loss she was experiencing while her husband was still alive. But, she continued, and her voice grew stronger, when I put on George Strait's music, something magical happens. Frank remembers the words to every single song, and when I Cross My Heart plays, he takes my hand and we danced just like we did 51 years ago. For those 3 minutes and 52 seconds, I have my husband back completely." Frank Williams, despite his condition, seemed to understand what was happening. He took his wife's hand and, in a voice that was surprisingly strong and clear, began to sing along with the music that had started playing softly in the background. "I cross my heart and promise to give all I've got to give to make all your dreams come true." The entire amphitheater joined in, 300 voices united in a song about eternal love and commitment. George found himself singing along, his distinctive voice blending with the crowd, and for the first time all day, he didn't care if anyone recognized him. As the song concluded, he realized that Emma was staring at him with wide eyes, her mouth slightly open in amazement. "Grandpa George," she whispered, "that's your voice I hear on the radio at home, isn't it?" The question hung in the air between them, like a bridge that, once crossed, would change everything. George looked down into Emma's innocent blue eyes, seeing not just curiosity, but the dawning realization of a 10-year-old mind, putting together pieces of a puzzle she hadn't even known she was solving. Around them, the crowd continued to applaud the Williams' touching moment, but for George, the entire world had narrowed to this small girl and her simple, devastating question. "What makes you think that, sweetheart?" George asked softly, though he already knew his voice had given him away. Years of performing had made his vocal patterns as distinctive as a fingerprint, and even his attempt to disguise himself couldn't hide the natural cadence and tone that had made him famous. Emma studied his face with the intense concentration that children bring to important discoveries. "At home, when Grandma Norma plays your music while she's cooking, you always sing along perfectly, and just now, when everyone was singing, your voice sounded exactly like the man on the radio." She paused, tilting her head thoughtfully. "Plus, you're wearing that funny shirt and those silly glasses, like you're trying to hide from something." George felt a mixture of pride and trepidation. Emma's observation skills were remarkably sharp for her age, a trait she had clearly inherited from the Strait family line. But her discovery also meant that the simple, anonymous day he had planned was about to become infinitely more complicated. Before he could respond, the performer on stage began speaking again, and George's attention was reluctantly drawn back to the continuing tribute. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a very special announcement. Earlier today, we were informed that someone very special is here with us in the park today, enjoying time with his family." George's stomach dropped like a stone. This was exactly what he had feared, what he had tried so hard to avoid. He started to stand, ready to grab Emma's hand and make a quick exit, but she tugged on his sleeve, keeping him seated. "Wait, Grandpa," she whispered urgently. "I want to hear what they're going to say about you." The performer continued, his voice carrying easily through the amphitheater's excellent acoustics. "Out of respect for his privacy and his desire to spend quality time with his loved ones, we won't point him out or ask him to reveal himself. But we want him to know that if he's listening, his music has touched more lives than he could possibly imagine." George relaxed slightly, grateful for the continued discretion. Tyler had apparently been true to his word about keeping his presence confidential, and the park staff was clearly committed to protecting his privacy while still acknowledging his significance. "In fact," the performer went on, "we'd like to share just a few more stories about how George Strait's music has impacted lives, because we think it's important for everyone to understand that country music isn't just entertainment, it's medicine for the soul." Emma looked up at George with wide eyes, and he could see the wheels turning in her young mind. She was beginning to understand that her grandfather wasn't just someone who sang along with the radio. He was the person whose voice came through the speakers, whose words had somehow helped strangers through their darkest moments. A middle-aged woman near the center of the amphitheater stood up, her hand raised tentatively. The performer noticed her and gestured encouragingly. "Ma'am, would you like to share something?" The woman nodded and made her way toward the front, her movements suggesting nervousness but also determination. She was probably in her 40s, with graying brown hair and the weathered hands of someone who worked outdoors. When she reached the microphone, she took a deep breath before speaking. "My name is Maria Gonzalez, and I work at a children's hospital in Houston," she began, her voice growing stronger as she continued. "For the past 15 years, I've been a nurse in the pediatric oncology ward, working with children who have cancer." George felt his breath catch. He had always been particularly moved by stories involving sick children, perhaps because of his own loss of Jennifer, perhaps because children's suffering seemed especially cruel and unfair. Maria continued, "Anyone who works with seriously ill children will tell you that music is one of our most powerful tools. It can calm a frightened child before surgery, it can help them sleep when they're in pain, and it can give them something to focus on besides their illness." She paused, gathering her thoughts, and George could see tears forming in her eyes. "There's one song in particular that has become legendary in our ward. We call it the Miracle Song, and it's George Strait's I Believe." George's heart clenched. I Believe was the song he had written after Jennifer's death, his attempt to process his grief and find some meaning in unthinkable loss. It was deeply personal, drawn from his own struggle to understand how God could take a 13-year-old girl with her whole life ahead of her. "I can't count how many times I've seen that song work miracles," Maria said, her voice now thick with emotion. Children who were too scared to speak would start singing along. Teenagers facing chemotherapy would request it before their treatments. Parents keeping vigil beside their child's bed would find comfort in its message about angels and heaven. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand before continuing. "Last year, we had a 7-year-old boy named Miguel who was in the final stages of leukemia. His parents had been told there was nothing more we could do, and they were facing the impossible task of saying goodbye to their son." George felt Emma's hand slip into his again, though he wasn't sure if she was offering comfort or seeking it. The story was almost too painful to hear, but he found himself unable to look away from Maria's face as she continued. "Miguel loved that song," Maria said. "He would request it every day, sometimes multiple times. His mother told me that before he got sick, Miguel wanted to be a cowboy when he grew up, and George Strait's music made him feel brave and strong like the cowboys in his favorite movies." The amphitheater had become completely quiet, everyone hanging on Maria's every word. Even the background noise of the park seemed to fade away, as if the entire world was listening to this story. "The night Miguel died," Maria continued, her voice barely above a whisper but still carrying clearly through the sound system, "his parents asked me to play I Believe one last time. As the song played, Miguel opened his eyes for the first time in days, looked at his parents and said, 'Don't be sad, the cowboy song says there are angels and I'm going to be one too.'" George couldn't stop the sob that escaped from his throat. Emma looked up at him with concern, but he couldn't speak, couldn't explain that this story was hitting him in a place where his professional composure couldn't protect him. Maria wasn't finished. "Miguel's parents later told me that they had never understood why their son loved that song so much until that moment. They realized that somehow, through George Strait's words about believing in things we can't see, their little boy had found a way to face death without fear." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of people quietly weeping throughout the amphitheater. George realized that his own tears were flowing freely now, and he no longer cared who might see them or what they might reveal about his identity. Emma tugged on his sleeve gently. "Grandpa," she whispered, "did you write that song about Aunt Jennifer?" George looked down at her, amazed once again by her perceptiveness. He had never explicitly told Emma about Jennifer's death. She knew she had an aunt who had died before Emma was born, but the details had always seemed too heavy for such young shoulders. "Yes, sweetheart," he whispered back. "I wrote it when I was very sad about losing your Aunt Jennifer, and I was trying to understand why sometimes bad things happen to good people." Emma nodded solemnly, processing this information with the seriousness that children bring to life's biggest questions. "So your song helped other people who were sad too?" "Apparently so," George said, his voice thick with emotion. The performer on stage began speaking again, apparently unaware of the quiet drama playing out in the back row. "We have time for one more story, and this one is particularly special because it comes from right here in Texas." An elderly man in the front row stood up slowly, using a walking cane for support. He was probably in his 80s, with silver hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent under the Texas sun. When he reached the microphone, he adjusted it to accommodate his shorter stature and cleared his throat. "My name is Robert Bob Henderson," he said in a voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. "I'm a retired high school principal from a small town about 2 hours north of here. For 38 years, I watched teenagers struggle with all the challenges that come with growing up. Family problems, academic pressure, social difficulties, and sometimes much worse." George found himself leaning forward, intrigued by where this story might lead. Emma was listening intently as well, though he suspected she was as much interested in watching her grandfather's reactions as in hearing the story itself. Bob continued, About 20 years ago, I started noticing something interesting. The kids who seemed to handle life's challenges best, who showed the most resilience and character, often had one thing in common. They listened to country music, and George Strait in particular. This was not what George had expected to hear. He had always hoped his music was positive, but he had never thought of it as having educational or developmental benefits for young people. Now, I'm not saying that music was the only factor, Bob clarified, but I started paying attention to the lyrics these kids were absorbing. Songs like The Chair taught them about respect and courtesy. All My Exes Live in Texas showed them how to handle heartbreak with humor and grace. Carrying Your Love With Me demonstrated the importance of commitment and faithfulness. Emma whispered, "He's talking about your songs like they're school lessons." George almost smiled despite his emotional state. That was exactly what Bob was doing, and the idea that his music had served as a kind of informal curriculum for character development was both surprising and deeply gratifying. Bob's voice grew stronger as he continued. "I started incorporating country music, especially George Strait's songs, into my guidance counseling sessions. When a student was struggling with self-worth, I might play I Cross My Heart and talk about the importance of keeping promises to yourself. When someone was dealing with peer pressure, we'd listen to Right or Wrong and discuss the courage it takes to stand by your convictions." The old principal paused, looking out over the audience with the expression of someone who had spent decades caring about young people's development. "I kept track over the years, and I can tell you with confidence that the students who connected with those messages went on to become some of the finest adults I've ever known. They became teachers, doctors, military officers, business owners, and parents who are now raising their own children with those same values." George felt a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the Texas heat. He had always known that country music carried messages about values and character, but hearing it described as having such a concrete, positive impact on young people's development was overwhelming. George Strait's music didn't just entertain those kids, Bob concluded. It helped raise them. It gave them a framework for understanding what it means to be a good person, a reliable friend, a faithful partner, and a contributing member of society. As Bob made his way back to his seat, the applause that followed was different from what had come before. It wasn't just appreciation for a touching story, it was recognition of something profound about the power of art to shape character and influence lives across generations. Emma was staring at George with an expression he had never seen before, a mixture of awe, pride, and something that looked almost like reverence. "Grandpa," she said quietly, "you're not just a singer, are you? You're like a teacher. But instead of a classroom, you teach people through their radios and their hearts." George felt his throat tighten with emotion. Out of the mouths of babes, he thought. This 10-year-old girl had just articulated something that he had never fully understood about his own career and its significance. Before he could respond, the performer on stage made an announcement that caused George's blood to run cold. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a very special surprise for our final song today. We've been informed that we have some very special guests here, people who have been directly touched by George Strait's music and want to participate in our tribute." George watched in amazement as people began standing up throughout the amphitheater. Not just a few people, but dozens, then more than 100. Each person who stood was holding something in their hand, though from his position in the back, George couldn't quite make out what it was. The performer's voice carried clearly through the sound system. "These wonderful people have come forward to share that George Strait's music has played a significant role in their lives, helping them through difficult times, celebrating their joyful moments, or simply providing a soundtrack to their American dreams." As George watched, the people who had stood began moving toward the stage area, and he could finally see what they were carrying. Each person held a single white rose, and as they gathered in the open space in front of the stage, they began arranging themselves into a formation that took George's breath away. They were forming the shape of a heart. Emma gasped beside him. "Grandpa, look! They're making a heart just for you." The performer continued his explanation as the human heart took shape. The white rose has special significance in George Strait's story. After the tragic loss of his daughter Jennifer in a car accident, George established a foundation in her memory, and the white rose became a symbol of that foundation's work, helping other families facing similar tragedies. George's vision blurred completely now. He had indeed established a foundation after Jennifer's death, but it had always been a quiet effort, something he supported financially but didn't publicize. He had no idea that the white rose symbol had become so widely recognized or meaningful to his fans. And now, the performer announced, we'd like to invite everyone to join us in singing the song that George wrote as a tribute to his daughter, a song that has brought comfort to countless families facing loss, I Believe. The opening notes began to play, soft and reverent, and George watched in amazement as the 100+ people forming the heart began to sing a cappella, their voices blending in harmony that seemed to rise straight to heaven itself. All my life I believed in things I could not see, right and wrong, the promised land, the space between you and me. Emma's voice joined in, small but clear, and George realized she knew every word. Of course she did. This song played regularly on the radio, and Norma often had George's music playing around the house. But hearing his granddaughter sing the words he had written in his deepest grief, seeing her connect those words to the story of the aunt she had never met, broke something open in George's heart that he had kept carefully guarded for decades. As the song continued, more voices joined from throughout the amphitheater, until it seemed like everyone present was singing. The harmonies were imperfect, the timing wasn't precise, but the emotion and sincerity more than made up for any technical shortcomings. When they reached the chorus, George found his own voice joining in, no longer caring who heard him or recognized him. I believe there are angels among us, sent down to us from somewhere up above. They come to you and me in our darkest hours to show us how to live, to teach us how to give, to guide us with a light of love. As the song built to its climax, George felt something shift inside him. All his life he had written and performed music as a form of personal expression, as a way to make a living, as entertainment for others. But sitting here, watching hundreds of people sing his most personal song, with such obvious sincerity and gratitude, he finally understood what his music had really become. It had become a ministry. Not in a religious sense necessarily, but in the truest meaning of the word: service to others, comfort for the afflicted, hope for the hopeless, strength for the weary. The song was building toward its conclusion, and George knew that when it ended, he would have to make a choice. He could remain hidden in the shadows, preserving his anonymity and the simple grandfather role he had wanted to maintain. Or he could step forward and acknowledge what he had just witnessed. This incredible testimony to the power of music, to heal and inspire and connect human hearts across all boundaries of age, race, and circumstance. Emma seemed to sense his internal struggle. She looked up at him with those wise blue eyes and said simply, "I think they need to know you heard them, Grandpa." And in that moment, George Strait knew exactly what he had to do. The final notes of I Believe faded into the warm Texas air, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt sacred. George sat frozen in his seat, his heart pounding as he watched the 100+ people who had formed the human heart slowly lower their white roses. The moment stretched like a held breath, and he could feel the weight of decision pressing down on him like the summer heat. Emma's small hand squeezed his fingers. "It's okay, Grandpa," she whispered, her voice carrying a wisdom that seemed far beyond her 10 years. "They love you. I can see it in their faces." George looked out over the amphitheater, really seeing the faces for the first time. There were teenagers sitting next to grandparents, veterans in wheelchairs beside young mothers holding babies, couples who had clearly been together for decades, sharing this moment with families just starting their journeys together. These weren't just fans. They were people whose lives had been touched, shaped, and in some cases saved by words he had written in quiet moments of inspiration, heartbreak, and hope. The performer on stage seemed to sense that something significant was about to happen. Instead of moving to close the show, he stood quietly at the microphone, his eyes scanning the audience as if searching for something or someone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said finally, his voice soft but carrying clearly through the sound system, "I want to thank everyone who shared their stories today. Music has the power to heal, to inspire, and to connect us all in ways that sometimes seem almost miraculous." He paused, and George could see him looking directly toward the back section where they sat, though the performer gave no indication that he could actually see through George's disguise. "To the special guest who may be listening, I want you to know that your presence here today, even if silent and hidden, has made this tribute more meaningful than you could possibly imagine. Sometimes the greatest gift an artist can give their audience is simply to witness the impact of their work. George felt his resolve crystallizing. Emma was right. These people needed to know he had heard them, that their stories mattered, that their connection to his music was real and reciprocated. But more than that, George realized he needed them to know too. He needed to acknowledge this incredible outpouring of love and gratitude, not for his ego, but because ignoring it would be a disservice to the profound sharing that had just taken place. Slowly, with trembling hands, George reached up and removed his dark sunglasses. The late afternoon sun caught his weathered face, and even from the back of the amphitheater, his distinctive features were unmistakable. Few people in the closer rows began to turn in their seats, whispers rippling through the crowd like gentle waves. Emma beamed up at him with pure pride. "There's my real Grandpa George," she said loudly enough that people around them could hear. George stood up, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him. The ridiculous Hawaiian shirt with dancing flamingos suddenly seemed less important than the authenticity of the moment. As more people recognized him, the whispers grew louder, but instead of the chaotic excitement he had feared, there was something almost reverent in the crowd's reaction. The performer on stage noticed the commotion in the back and shaded his eyes with his hand, trying to see what was causing the stir. When his gaze found George, his face broke into a smile of pure amazement and gratitude. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice thick with emotion, "it appears our special guest has decided to join us." The applause that erupted was unlike anything George had experienced in 50 years of performing. It wasn't the wild cheering of concert crowds or the polite appreciation of awards ceremonies. This was something deeper. Recognition, gratitude, and love all rolled into a sound that seemed to come from the very souls of everyone present. Emma took his hand, and together they began making their way down the amphitheater steps. People reached out to touch his arm as he passed, not grabbing or demanding, but offering gentle contact that felt like blessing. An elderly woman pressed a white rose into Emma's hand. A young man simply said, "Thank you for saving my marriage," as George walked by. A veteran in a wheelchair saluted as they passed his row. When they reached the stage area, George felt overwhelmed by the sea of faces looking at him with such open affection and gratitude. He had performed for audiences of 50,000 or more, but somehow this intimate gathering of 300 felt more significant than any stadium show he had ever given. The performer handed him the microphone with shaking hands. "Mr. Strait," he said quietly, "it's an honor beyond words." George took the microphone, looking out over the audience that had shared so much of themselves with him, unknowingly, over the past hour. Emma stood beside him, still clutching the white rose, her face glowing with pride and excitement. "Well," George began, his distinctive voice carrying easily through the amphitheater's sound system, "I have to say this wasn't exactly what I had planned when I decided to take my granddaughter Emma here to the park today." The crowd laughed warmly, and George could feel some of his nervousness beginning to ease. These weren't strangers anymore. They were people who had shared their most intimate stories with him, even if they hadn't known he was listening. "I came here hoping to give Emma a normal day, away from cameras and reporters and all the complications that come with, well, with being me." He looked down at Emma, who was beaming up at him. "What I didn't expect was for her to give me something far more valuable than a normal day. She gave me the chance to understand what my music really means." He paused, gathering his thoughts and his courage. "For 50 years, I've been writing and singing songs, and I always hoped they would touch people's hearts. But sitting in that back row today, listening to your stories, I realized I never truly understood the impact that music could have on real lives." Sarah Martinez, the young woman who had shared her story about losing her father, called out from the audience, "Your music saved my life, Mr. Strait." George's voice broke slightly as he responded, "No, Sarah. Your courage in sharing your story saved mine. All of you did." He looked around the amphitheater, making eye contact with as many people as he could. "Maria, when you told us about little Miguel and how I believe helped him face his final moments without fear, that song came from my own grief over losing my daughter Jennifer. I wrote it because I was angry and confused and desperate to find meaning in meaningless loss. I never imagined it could help a 7-year-old boy become an angel." Maria nodded from her seat, tears streaming down her face. George continued, "And Bob, hearing that my songs helped you teach young people about character and values, that means more to me than every award I've ever received. Music should do more than just entertain. It should help us become better versions of ourselves. His voice grew stronger as he found his rhythm, as he connected with the audience the way he had thousands of times before, but with a depth and authenticity that felt entirely new. "Sergeant Rodriguez, when you talked about my music keeping you and your fellow Marines human in the middle of war, you reminded me why I fell in love with country music in the first place. It's music for real people facing real challenges, and if my songs helped bring you home safely to your families, then every hour I spent writing them was blessed." The veteran stood and saluted again, and this time George saluted back. "Mrs. Williams," George said, turning to the elderly woman whose husband battled Alzheimer's, "the fact that I cross my heart can bring your Frank back to you, even if just for a few minutes, proves that love really is stronger than any disease, any obstacle, any challenge life can throw at us." Frank Williams, despite his condition, seemed to understand what was happening. He stood slowly and began to applaud, his face showing a clarity that his wife hadn't seen in months. George felt tears running down his cheeks, but he no longer cared who saw them. "I want all of you to know that this afternoon has changed me. I thought I was just a grandfather trying to give his granddaughter a fun day at an amusement park. Instead, you've shown me that music isn't just my career, it's been my ministry, not in a religious sense, but in the truest meaning of service to others." Emma tugged on his sleeve gently. George leaned down so she could whisper in his ear, "Tell them about Aunt Jennifer, Grandpa. Tell them why that song is so special." George straightened up, looking out over the sea of faces that had become so dear to him in such a short time. "My granddaughter just reminded me of something important. When I wrote I Believe, I was trying to make sense of losing my 13-year-old daughter Jennifer in a car accident. She was bright and beautiful and full of dreams, and when she died I thought my world had ended." The amphitheater was completely silent, everyone hanging on his words. "But listening to your stories today, I realized that Jennifer's life didn't end that day. It transformed. Through that song, through the foundation we started in her memory, through the white roses you all carried today, she's been touching lives for decades. Miguel, that brave little boy Maria told us about, he was touched by Jennifer's spirit. Sarah, when that song helped you choose life over despair, Jennifer was there with you." He looked down at Emma, who was listening with the same rapt attention as everyone else. "And now, watching my granddaughter discover what her aunt's life and death have meant to so many people, I see that love really doesn't end. It just changes form and keeps growing." The crowd began to applaud again, but George held up his hand gently. "Before you applaud, let me applaud you. Every person who shared a story today showed incredible courage. You opened your hearts and trusted strangers with your most precious memories and your deepest pain. That's not easy to do, and I'm honored that you felt safe enough to share those stories here." He paused, looking around at all the faces that had become so important to him. "I came here today as George Strait, trying to hide from being George Strait. I'm leaving here as someone who finally understands what George Strait's music has really been about all these years." The performer who had been hosting the tribute stepped forward. "Mr. Strait, on behalf of everyone here, I want to thank you for being willing to step forward and acknowledge what we shared today. Most artists never get to witness the impact of their work so directly." George nodded his appreciation, then made a decision that surprised even himself. "You know, I think there's one more thing we need to do before we end this incredible afternoon." He turned to the audience. "I'd like to invite everyone who feels comfortable to join me on this stage. Let's sing I Believe together one more time, but this time as a celebration rather than a tribute. A celebration of the fact that love never dies, that music connects us all, and that sometimes the most beautiful moments in life come when we least expect them." People began moving toward the stage, and George was amazed at how many accepted his invitation. Young and old, individuals and families, people with tears in their eyes and smiles on their faces, they all came forward to share this moment. Emma stayed close by his side as the crowd gathered on and around the stage. When everyone was assembled, George began the opening lines of the song a cappella, his voice clear and strong. "All my life I believed in things I could not see. One by one, other voices joined in, creating a harmony that seemed to rise straight to heaven." George looked out over this incredible gathering of people, strangers an hour ago, now connected forever by shared music and shared stories, and felt a completeness he had never experienced before. As they sang about angels and love and the power of believing in things beyond our understanding, George realized that he was witnessing exactly what the song described. These weren't just people singing together. They were angels who who had been sent to show him something beautiful about his own life and work. When the song ended, the applause was long and heartfelt, but it wasn't really applause anymore. It was gratitude made audible, love expressed through the universal language of appreciation. As people began to slowly disperse, many stopped to shake George's hand or hug Emma, or simply say thank you. The elderly couple, Frank and Betty Williams, approached together, with Betty supporting her husband's steps. "Mr. Strait," Betty said, her voice still strong despite her age, "Frank wants to tell you something." Frank looked up at George with eyes that seemed clearer than they had all afternoon. In a voice that was surprisingly steady, he said, "Thank you for helping me remember love." George felt his throat close with emotion. "Thank you for showing me what love looks like after 50 years of marriage." As the amphitheater gradually emptied, George found himself standing on the stage with Emma, the performer, and a few park staff members. The late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the seats, and the magic of what had just happened was settling into memory. Emma looked up at him with those wise blue eyes. "Grandpa, are you sad that people know who you are now?" George considered the question carefully. The simple, anonymous day he had planned was certainly over. Tomorrow, there would probably be photos and videos circulating on social media. His quiet family time would likely be complicated by renewed attention from fans and media. But looking down at his granddaughter, seeing the pride and love in her face, and remembering the incredible gift he had been given today, George realized he couldn't regret a single moment of it. "No, sweetheart," he said finally. "Today I learned that some things are more important than privacy. Some things are so beautiful that hiding from them would be a sin." Emma smiled and took his hand. "Can we still ride the roller coaster before we go home?" George laughed, a sound of pure joy that echoed across the empty amphitheater. "Absolutely. After all, we came here for an adventure, didn't we?" As they walked toward the roller coaster section of the park, George realized that the biggest adventure of the day was already over. He had discovered something precious about his own legacy, about the power of music to heal and inspire, and about the courage it takes to step out of the shadows and acknowledge the light. But the day wasn't over yet, and somehow George sensed that there was still one more surprise waiting for them. As they walked toward the roller coaster section of the park, George noticed that word of his presence had spread quickly but respectfully through Lone Star Adventureland. Families smiled and waved from a distance, teenagers took discreet photos on their phones, and park employees nodded with genuine warmth rather than intrusive excitement. It was exactly the kind of recognition George could live with, acknowledgement without chaos, appreciation without invasion. Emma skipped beside him, still clutching the white rose someone had given her, her face glowing with the kind of happiness that can only come from experiencing something truly special. "Grandpa, when we get home, can we tell Grandma Norma about everything that happened? She's going to be so proud of you." George chuckled, imagining Norma's reaction when they recounted this incredible day. "She's going to say I should have worn a better disguise," he said, looking down at his ridiculous Hawaiian shirt. These dancing flamingos weren't exactly subtle. They had just reached the entrance to the Texas Tornado, the park's most impressive roller coaster, when George heard someone calling his name from behind. He turned to see Tyler, the young man from the ticket booth, jogging toward them with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Mr. Strait, sir, I'm so sorry to bother you," Tyler said, slightly out of breath from his run across the park. "But I have something really important to tell you, and I wasn't sure if I'd get another chance." George stopped, immediately concerned by the urgency in Tyler's voice. "Of course, son. What's on your mind?" Tyler glanced around, making sure they had relative privacy, then looked directly at George with eyes that held both nervousness and determination. "When you came through my booth earlier, I recognized you right away, but I didn't say anything because I could tell you wanted to have a normal day with your granddaughter, and I appreciate that more than you know," George said warmly. "But here's the thing," Tyler continued, his words coming faster now as his excitement grew. "I immediately called my manager to let him know you were here, not to cause trouble or anything, but because we have something special planned that I thought you should know about." George felt a familiar tightness in his stomach. Had this entire experience been orchestrated? Had his spontaneous discovery of the tribute show actually been planned in advance? Tyler must have seen the concern on George's face, because he quickly raised his hands in a gesture of reassurance. No, sir. Not like that. The tribute show happens every day at the same time. That wasn't set up for you. What I'm talking about is something else entirely. Emma tugged on George's sleeve. "What kind of something special?" she asked Tyler directly. Tyler grinned down at her. "Well, young lady, that's what I'm trying to tell your grandfather. You see, about 6 months ago, our park's board of directors approved a new project. We wanted to create something that would honor the musical heritage of Texas, something that would give back to the community in a meaningful way." He paused, building suspense in the way that only someone who truly understood the power of a good story could. "We've been quietly planning to announce the creation of the Lone Star Music Therapy Center right here in the park. It's going to provide free music therapy sessions for children dealing with serious illnesses, disabilities, or trauma." George felt his breath catch. Music therapy was something he had always believed in, but had never been directly involved with, despite knowing how powerful music could be in healing. Tyler continued, his voice growing more excited. "The thing is, we wanted to name the center after someone who embodies the healing power of country music, someone whose songs have already proven their ability to help people through difficult times." Emma's eyes were growing wide as she began to understand where this was heading. "Mr. Strait," Tyler said, his voice now filled with hope and anticipation, "we were planning to call it the Jennifer Strait Music Therapy Center, in honor of your daughter's memory and the foundation you created after her passing." George felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. This was so far beyond anything he could have expected or imagined that he had to reach out and steady himself against a nearby railing. Tyler noticed his reaction and quickly continued. "We were going to send you a formal letter next week, asking for your permission to use Jennifer's name, along with an invitation to attend the groundbreaking ceremony. But having you here today, having witnessed what just happened at the tribute show, it feels like fate." Emma looked up at George with tears in her eyes. "Grandpa, they want to help sick kids like that little boy Miguel, and they want to do it in Aunt Jennifer's name?" George nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. The symmetry was almost too perfect to believe. On a day when he had discovered how profoundly his music had touched people's lives, he was being offered the chance to create something that would extend that healing power in Jennifer's memory. Tyler seemed to understand that this was an overwhelming moment. "You don't have to give us an answer today, of course. This is a lot to process, and I probably should have waited for the official letter. But when I saw what happened at the tribute show, when I watched you connect with all those people whose lives you've touched, I just felt like you needed to know that Jennifer's impact is going to keep growing." George found his voice, though it was rougher than usual. "Tyler, how old are you?" The question seemed to surprise the young man. 22, sir." "And this was your idea?" Tyler shook his head. "No, sir. Actually, it came from someone much smarter than me. My grandmother. She's been a fan of your music her whole life, and when she heard about the therapy center project, she suggested Jennifer's name. She said that if music saved her through her own dark times, maybe it could be Jennifer's gift to other families facing similar struggles." George felt tears welling up again. "What's your grandmother's name, son?" "Eleanor Mitchell, but everyone calls her Ellie. She's 84 and still comes to every one of your concerts that comes within 200 miles of here." George smiled through his tears. "I'd like to meet Ellie sometime." "She'd probably faint," Tyler said with a laugh, "but she'd love it." Emma had been listening to this entire exchange with the intense concentration she brought to everything important. Now she spoke up, her young voice carrying surprising authority. "Grandpa," she said, "I think Aunt Jennifer would want you to say yes." George looked down at his granddaughter, this wise little soul who had already shown him so much today. "What makes you think that, sweetheart?" Emma's answer was simple, but profound. "Because all day today, people have been telling us how your songs helped them when they were sad or scared. And Aunt Jennifer was your daughter, so helping sad and scared kids would be like her job, right? Like what daughters do for their daddies, but for lots of kids instead of just one." The wisdom of children never ceased to amaze George. In her innocent way, Emma had captured exactly what this opportunity represented, a chance to transform his personal grief into ongoing healing for countless other families. Tyler watched this exchange with obvious emotion. "Mr. Strait, I don't want to pressure you, but there's one more thing you should know. We've already raised most of the funding for the center, and we have commitments from several excellent music therapists who want to be part of the program. We could have it operational within 6 months of breaking ground. And," he added with a slight smile, "we were hoping you might consider being present for the ribbon-cutting ceremony, not to perform or anything like that, just to officially open Jennifer's center. George looked around at this place where so much had changed for him in just one afternoon. The park was still busy with families enjoying their day, children laughing on rides, parents creating memories with their children. It was exactly the kind of place where healing should happen, where joy should be cultivated, where music should work its magic. "Tyler," he said finally, "you can tell your board of directors that they have my blessing to name the center after Jennifer. More than that, they have my commitment to be actively involved in making sure it succeeds." Tyler's face broke into a grin so wide it seemed to split his face in half. "Are you serious? You'll really do it?" "I'll do more than that," George continued, his mind already racing with possibilities. "I'll help with fundraising, I'll participate in the ribbon cutting, and I'll make sure every music therapist they hire understands that they're not just providing a service, they're continuing Jennifer's legacy of bringing light into dark places." Emma jumped up and down with excitement. "Does this mean we get to come back to the park for the ribbon cutting?" George laughed, picking her up and spinning her around. "It means we get to be part of something beautiful, sweetheart. Something that will help lots of kids for many years to come." Tyler was practically vibrating with excitement. "Mr. Strait, this is incredible. Wait until I tell my grandmother. She's not going to believe it." "Before you call her," George said, "I want you to know that meeting you today has been almost as meaningful as everything else that happened. You showed respect for my privacy, when you could have caused a scene. You've been thoughtful about approaching me with this opportunity, and you're clearly someone who understands that fame should be used to help others, not just for personal gain." Tyler blushed at the praise. "My grandmother raised me to treat everyone with respect, famous or not. She always said that if you're lucky enough to meet your heroes, you should make sure you don't disappoint them." George extended his hand to Tyler, and the young man shook it with obvious reverence. "You haven't disappointed anyone today, son. In fact, you've made this day perfect." As Tyler headed back toward his station, practically floating with excitement about the news he would soon share, George and Emma finally made their way onto the Texas Tornado roller coaster. As they climbed higher and higher toward the first big drop, Emma suddenly grabbed George's arm. "Grandpa, look!" She pointed toward the amphitheater where the tribute show had taken place. From this height they could see that many of the people who had participated in the show were still gathered in small groups, talking and sharing contact information, clearly reluctant to let the magic of the afternoon end. "They're going to stay friends because of what happened today, aren't they?" Emma observed. George watched the scene below, marveling at his granddaughter's perceptiveness. "I think you're right, sweetheart. Sometimes special moments bring people together in ways that last long after the moment itself is over." The roller coaster reached its peak and paused for just a moment before the big drop. In that suspended instant, George could see the entire park spread out below them, filled with families making memories, children discovering joy, and people of all ages finding reasons to smile. "Are you ready?" Emma asked, squeezing his hand as they prepared for the thrilling descent. George squeezed back, thinking about everything this day had brought him. The unexpected revelation of his music's impact, the courage to step out of hiding, the gift of seeing himself through Emma's eyes, and now the opportunity to create something lasting in Jennifer's memory. "I'm ready," he said, and meant it in ways that went far beyond the roller coaster. As they plunged down the track, Emma's laughter mixing with his own and echoing across the park, George realized that this day had given him something he hadn't even known he was looking for, a new understanding of his purpose, a deeper connection with his granddaughter, and a way to transform old grief into new hope. When they finally returned home that evening, Norma was waiting on the porch with 2 glasses of sweet tea and a knowing smile. "I take it you didn't exactly blend in today," she said, noting George's still ridiculous Hawaiian shirt and Emma's excited chatter about everything they had experienced. "Grandma Norma, you should have seen it!" Emma burst out before George could answer. Grandpa found out that his songs help people when they're sad, and then he got on stage and sang with everybody. And now they're going to build a special place for sick kids and name it after Aunt Jennifer. Norma looked at George with raised eyebrows and an expression that combined amusement, pride, and love in equal measure. "Sounds like you had quite an adventure." George settled into his favorite porch chair, Emma climbing into his lap even though she was really getting too big for it, and began to tell Norma about the most extraordinary day of his life. As he spoke, watching the sun set over the Texas landscape he loved, with his wife and granddaughter beside him, George realized that he had been given something incredibly precious. He had discovered that his music wasn't just his career, it was his ministry. He had learned that love really doesn't end when someone dies. It just transforms and keeps growing. And he had found a way to honor Jennifer's memory that would help countless other families facing similar struggles. Most importantly, he had shared it all with Emma, who would carry these memories and these lessons forward into her own life, ensuring that the healing power of love and music would continue for another generation. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Emma fell asleep in his lap, still clutching the white rose someone had given her at the park. George held her gently, listening to Norma hum one of his old songs while she rocked in her chair, and felt a contentment deeper than any he had known in years. Tomorrow he would start planning the Jennifer Strait Music Therapy Center. Next week he would call Tyler's grandmother Ellie and thank her for raising such a thoughtful grandson. Next month, he would begin working with music therapists to design programs that would bring healing to children facing their darkest hours. But tonight, he was simply a grandfather who had been given the gift of seeing his life's work through the eyes of the people it had touched, and who had discovered that the greatest legacy anyone can leave is love that keeps growing long after they're gone. The day George Strait had planned to be simple and anonymous had become the day he finally understood the true meaning of his life's work. And as he sat there under the Texas stars, holding his sleeping granddaughter and listening to his wife's gentle humming, George knew that Jennifer would be proud of what this day had begun. The king of country music had become something even more important. A grandfather who understood that love, like music, has the power to heal the world, one heart at a time.